My guest tonight is David Salle, a wonderful American painter who has lived and worked in New York City and out here in the Hamptons for several decades now. And whose work we are surrounded by. And just a brief little biographical intro for David. He was born in Norman, Oklahoma. Have you seen the new production of Oklahoma yet? It's really wonderful. And but raised in Wichita, Kansas. He was educated at Cal Arts in Los Angeles. He got his BFA in '73 and his MA in '75, and then he moved to New York that same year. David started out as a painter, got somewhat derailed by conceptual art, working with John Baldessari at Cal Arts. And you said something really funny about when you moved back to New York City, and it was really good for you to be a conceptual artist at that time because you didn't have a painting studio and you didn't really need one to be a conceptual artist. But talk about that, a little bit about that experience at Cal Arts, going in as a painter when that was kind of disregarded or disrespected.
Well, yeah, no, it's a good question. I didn't know that painting was on the way out. I was naive, a kid from Kansas. No one had told me that painting was about to be devalued. And so I went to Cal Arts, not just wanting to be a painter, wanting to be a New York school painter, which might seem strange because we were in Los Angeles. But the focus of the school was completely New York-centric. There was in that time, in 1970, what constituted the Los Angeles art scene, or the Venice, California art scene, was very, very far from the kinds of things that I was interested in or my classmates were interested in. And the faculty of the school was entirely New York-centric. So we were, in a way, a kind of New York island in the middle of Los Angeles. We had nothing to do with Los Angeles art scene. Then I met John Baldessari, who had evolved out of painting altogether and was one of the principal figures in the invention of this thing called conceptual art, whatever the hell that is. John just called his work post-studio art because, as Terry said, you didn't really need to have a studio. You could just work in a notebook or make a phone call to a fabricator and have something made. And it was very seductive as a kid because the smart kids were not painting. They were involved in all these other activities: performance, film, video, installation, writing, activism, ecological research, all the things except painting were attracting the cool kids, and I wanted to be among them. So I took a kind of 4-year hiatus from painting, which I often regret. I think it was, in a way, kind of a total waste of time, but it was okay. I mean, it worked out okay in the end.
One of your classmates was Eric Fischel, and when we did our exhibition some years ago, Unfinished Business, that talked about that time in Cal Arts where you and Ross Bleckner and Eric were all there at the same time. And in an interview, he said that what was interesting to him about meeting you at that time is that you had a big appetite for culture, much bigger than, say, Eric's was at the time, that you were interested and involved in music, and literature, and movies, and that it seemed to him that you had a much more broad base of interests than what he did, as a painter. He wanted to paint.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, in a way, Cal Arts was great for that, because that's sort of what the school had attempted to make into its mission, that there would be few boundaries between the arts. All the arts would commingle, and one could be influenced by a wide range of things. So it was the perfect place for me. And I don't know what to say about it, just that it was fun, and we absorbed what we absorbed. But it was a essentially unstructured place. You could do whatever you wanted to do, and it was a great place to be a dilettante.
And then did you still feel that way when you moved to New York in 75, or did your attitude about what to do next change?
That's a good question. I think it evolved. I think I always knew I would, well, I shouldn't say, I'm not sure what I always knew, if I knew anything, but even before going to art school, there had been in my psyche or my life a kind of tug of war between photography and painting. I was also making photographs very young as a child and dabbling in film, and as Eric observed, all these other means of representation. I somehow, in some part of me, knew that what I needed to do was find a form that would allow me to merge these things together, and it took a while to figure out what that was. But I sort of backed into painting one day by making linoleum block prints. I started carving little tiny figures in linoleum and stamping them on paper, but the paper always ripped because I was moving studios so frequently. And I thought, well, this is not very practical. Canvas is much more durable. So just by that simple, pragmatic step, I realized I had begun painting again. And then it was easy to make that transition more active.
Was representation of images always a major part of what you did? I mean, you never thought about abstract expressionism?
Well, of course I thought about it, and a certain part of me identifies strongly with abstraction, and certainly the abstract expressionist generation. It's a big part of I would say, my visual identity, but I don't feel that I have ever been. I've always been an imagist, always been an image maker, image user.
I think that knowing that music and cinema and theater and all of that stuff is all floating around in your head does make, in some way, understanding the collage idea of jamming pictures together to create different sorts of narratives that are very non-linear but do have points of entry makes sense.
Yeah, the question about juxtaposition and collage is obviously a really big area. We'd talk about that all night. I don't know what to say about it. In my recollection, it has a kind of specific origin. Going back to maybe 1971 or 72, I was making paintings that were as close to abstraction as anything I can remember doing, more or less gray rectangles, heavily influenced by Jasper Johns. But I was aware, in a way that might seem obvious now, but at the time felt kind of like a revelation. I was very aware of the wall that the painting was hanging on. So I wanted to find a way to bring awareness of the painting and the wall behind the painting at the same time. Somehow you could experience both. There was no the painting, it was the painting in context. How would you do that in a painting, other than draw a frame around it and point to it the way Joseph Kosuth might have done? And that was the beginning, the germination, the kind of germinating incident. I wanted to bring two states of mind together in a static object. So, and the other things were kind of ancillary to that, how to represent. That's something that the painters have been concerned with all through the 20th century. How to represent motion, movement across space, across time, all those things which are very much against painting's real nature, and yet somehow I've always interested certain kinds of painters that if you could make a painting behave, if you could make a dog behave like like a cat or something, it would be an interesting dog. We want to see that dog. Yeah, so in a way it was kind of foolish, but another way it was gave rise to developing this kind of vocabulary where the sequencing of things and the structuring of attention within the thing is, in a way, the painterly event itself.
You use representation, you certainly use images, and the installation of the permanent collection right now here at the Parrish is actually a really kind of a nice time to be talking about painting in all of its various forms. And we used the umbrella that every picture tells a story. That being said, the story might not necessarily be a narrative story. It might be a different kind of story.
Yeah, I mean, the interpretation of pictures is another one of these huge areas that's also just full of pitfalls and ways to go wrong. The one thing that I've tried to do in my work, or in my whole my life, that's kind of pretentious to say, is to offer a counter narrative to the literalist interpretation of stuff, whatever the stuff is, whatever it is we're talking about, whether it's an image in a painting, or a sentence in conversation. It's an awareness of something that's behind the thing which is being said, which is more interesting than the thing being said sometimes. So I'm not deliberately trying to frustrate anyone, least of all the viewer. However, I always remember something that Fairfield Porter, the great critic painter who lived in Southampton for many decades, Porter wrote, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. It's something like, if the most interesting thing about a work of art is the subject matter, it's probably a failure. Right? Or in other words, if the content is the most interesting thing about a work, it's probably not so good. So content qua content is in a way neither here nor there. Or it's not that it's neither here nor there, it's just it has to be subsumed into the presentational vocabulary at such a deep level that it comes out naturally. Can't be forced. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, and it's interesting because you mentioned Fairfield Porter, and when people walk into the gallery and they look at Porter's, and at first they are looking at the content, and it's like, oh well, there's a picture of.
Right, we know that house. We've been there.
We've seen Maine in the fall, and it isn't until you really start to kind of deconstruct your own way of looking at the picture plane to see all of the really challenging and interesting things that he's doing with paint and composition that almost then render the pictures abstract. And you stop thinking about this is a picture of his sister or Jane Freilich or somebody else.
Yeah, it's I would say very agreeably layered. First thing you see is a picture of someone, his daughter, his friend, his wife. And you say, that's what's her name? And then if it's a good painting, you very quickly get past that, and you start looking at it as an example of decision, as the result of a set of decisions. He had to decide this was going to be played. Almost like an actor portrays a role. This has to be played in this way. This has to be played in this way. This, if you downplay this over here, this other thing here becomes more important. In other words, you begin to appreciate it on a formal level. And formal doesn't mean cold or detached. It merely means performative. It's like that's what someone did. Then the next step is you reintegrate the content back into the form, having digested it as a formal performance. Then the fact that it's a painting of one of his family members becomes more important, it becomes a deeper experience of the picture. But you have to go through the formal part before the subject matter part can have any real significance. That's my view.
No, and we were just taking a little sneak preview of the Helen Frankenthaler show, and we were talking about this, watching her figure out what it means to actually make a painting. And you start to think about painting in a completely different way. It's not so simple. Painting is not just simply taking your canvas outside and making a picture of a boat.
Yeah, it looks simple after it's done, like everything in life.
It's supposed to, right? I mean, it's like you don't...
I've been reading, I guess we've all been reading Natalia Ginzburg lately. Her novels have been newly translated and reissued, not all of them, but some of them. And her style is, how to describe it, is extremely unadorned, seemingly unliterary. It's very straightforward, And yeah, you start thinking about it. Well, I'm going to write a story in the manner of Natalia Ginzburg, and you realize after the first sentence, it's so damn hard. There's so much artistry in that seeming artlessness. All art, whether it's writing or painting, whatever, is a set of decisions. Someone had to make the decisions, and then someone had to make those decisions fit into a larger pattern of recognition, and then make those decisions fit into a still larger pattern, and so on and so forth. But it all comes down to what your point of view is. If you're sketching the landscape, as we saw that one Helen Frankenthaler painting, where she's very directly transposing what she's seeing into some set of marks, or if it's something you're hearing and it's simply an oral experience, whatever it is, think about all the things that it's not, right? All the different ways you could have made that sound or sequenced those actions, and then you realize how unbelievably complicated it is to have arrived at that decision. Yeah.
Oh, the other thing you mentioned about Fairfield Porter, which I think is very relevant to you, is your mention that he was a painter and a writer and a critic, and there are, throughout history, certain instances of artists who are also very good at the written word and exploring, painting or art, and you're one of them. It seems to me that your parallel life as a writer and as an artist is a kind of an interesting thing to explore a little bit in terms of how you construct paintings and how you construct your written.
Yeah. Well,
projects.
Thanks, Terry. I mean, I think most painters I know anyway, are very articulate and usually pretty good raconteurs, or if not good raconteurs, have a very interestingly idiosyncratic way of talking about pictures. But few people take the time to write it down. It just takes an enormous amount of time. Why did I decide to do it? I don't know, because I could. I actually feel creatively fulfilled by the writing of just writing qua writing, and I'm writing about what I know, which happens to be painting or art generally. But obviously there's of course some political reasons in the background. I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing in terms of the writing, spending the time that it takes to do it, if I felt this kind of voice was being represented in art culture today. But I don't feel that it is. So it's simply incumbent on me to do that. There's someone's phone.
There's somebody who doesn't follow instructions.
Yeah.
Now you need to put $25 in the donation box as punishment for your phone going off.
I think the discourse around painting in particular, and visual culture in general, is on life support. It really needed all the help it could get, and I'm happy to do what I can. I'm just one person. I wish more people would do some similar things.
I find your writing about other painters in particular so illuminating and actually very optimistic and uplifting. I mean, I feel like I'm actually reading words by somebody who really is looking, and you actually wrote a book about looking. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I made a decision early on to only write about things that I felt good about. I have broken that rule a couple of notable times, but everyone knows it's much easier to write negative stuff than it is to write positive stuff. I mean, the stuff we don't like, it's pretty easy to riff on that. But if you ask yourself what it is you like about something that you do like, it's actually a harder question. But that was one kind of self-imposed rule. Yep. Well, as Terry said, the act of looking itself to me is so interestingly pleasurable, or pleasurably interesting, that I wanted to be able to, or at least attempt to, write down what I felt was at stake, or what was involved, and hopefully make it visible and accessible to other people, anyone who's has a passing interest in the discipline. It's what I feel I've gotten from so many great literary critics over the years, and from a very small handful of art critics over the years, that to be able to give that back was something that was important to me.
You said that for you, painting and advances in writing are now closer in spirit than at any other time in memory.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. There was a time, I'm not sure if we're still in it or not, we'll probably start. There was a time maybe 10 years ago when young writers were much more engaged with visual art than they had than any time that I was aware of since I've been around. And artists were becoming more engaged with writers. It was just more crossover, and you could imagine, if not prove, but you could imagine overlapping concerns. I mean, I'm thinking about now of writers like George Saunders who were making these highly synthetic, highly kind of confected sort of mini realities that I've never talked to him, but I can't imagine he wasn't influenced by looking at visual art. And I know many writers I know personally very well who talk about how much they've been influenced by visual art, visual culture. I think what I was referring to specifically was this idea that you don't have to play it straight. These forms can be reinvented on a small scale or a grand scale, but they're more malleable and more dexterous than we might have imagined. And there was a commonality at a certain point between painting and writing in that regard.
So skewing from the individual, painting in the studio more or less by yourself, writing in a writing room more or less by yourself. Another aspect of your career that I've always found very fascinating was your engagement with the theater and the cinema, and the fact that you designed sets for dance as well as you did something with an opera.
I did a couple of operas. I did maybe a dozen ballets and a few operas over the years. Yeah, I mean, the engagement with theater design really was from the standpoint of being a fan. I loved certain kinds of work, certain ballets so much. I would do anything to be involved with it. So I kind of volunteered my services. And then it turned out I was pretty good at it. And I had a feeling for that kind of theatrical space, what an audience can experience. And the person I was primarily collaborating with was the choreographer Carol Armitage, who wanted something similar from her own work, which is to say, she wanted to see just how much complexity an audience could absorb without falling into something sort of unintelligible chaos. So we were I don't know if we were the first, we were certainly among the first people to have ballet sets and backdrops which did not illustrate the dance, but were accompaniments to the dance without making any specific reference to anything. So it was abstract dance and imagistic, in my case, backdrops. They did not correlate except that they did. And then you had to ask yourself as an audience member, what the hell does that have to do with that? And for many people, it was very challenging. But for certain people, it felt natural. Well, of course, that fishing reel wants to be on stage when Vrishnikov is dancing a solo because it just does. And I think it's that kind of poetic, kind of serendipitous juxtaposition that became common currency 20 years later, and you started to see it show up in the writers I was talking about in that paragraph. So it's a kind of cultural freewheelingness and again, non-literal mindedness that we were promulgating on stage.
Well, I was reading that you said that there was a sense in what you were trying to do in the theater pieces was to develop a kind of a background, and that the dancers were the foreground. And it kind of reminds me of what you said earlier tonight when you were talking about how when you were making a painting, you were really thinking about the wall. And so how do you bring the wall and the painting together? How do you bring the background and the foreground together?
Yeah, that's a good observation. I'm always trying to get more into it, or I just, not that I'm trying to get more into it, I just experience things that way. I mean, I think we all do. We just maybe don't draw a frame around it. We all, I mean, not all, many of us are listening to the radio while we're doing something else, or we're watching something out of the corner of our eye while we're doing something else. I mean, we're all essentially visually and culturally multitasking, whether we're aware of it or not. It's just kind of fun to foreground that. Yeah.
We also talked a little bit about the kind of the nuts and bolts of learning how to make paintings for dance or theater at that scale, which is, I mean, these are monumental paintings, but you're talking about things that are 2 or 3 times the size.
These are merely big paintings. So I was telling Terry earlier that the first ballet set I did was for the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. Now, it's been a long time, but I think that proscenium is 45 feet tall by 65 feet wide. So the backdrop has to be even bigger because you need it to, it has to go up into the fly space and pass through the wings. So that's bigger than this room. And they were painted on the floor with really big ladders and really long brushes. You basically paint with a broom. The brush looks like a broom. You're walking on the painting, and you have no idea what it looks like. I mean, none. And you get it on stage, and sometimes they rig it, and you see it for the first time as the audience will see it, usually the day before the premiere, because that's the schedule in theater. And we had a terrible shock the first time at the Met, because they weren't very good. The drops had been painted by a quite inferior scenic shop, and they were rushed. And I certainly was not able at that time to look at something on the floor and imagine how it was going to look at the back of the theater. And I had to get up on a ladder and repaint them at night on stage after they'd been hung. That was something I'm never going to do again.
Been there, done that. We shared that when I was in undergraduate school, and actually even earlier, I actually apprenticed as a scene painter. And I learned how to make these great big drops from, guild membership scene painters, and we worked from gridded out mock-ups. So, we had an idea of what it was going to look like. Basically, if you think of Chuck Close and the grid in a room the size of this with a great big canvas, but you're really basically working one square at a time. But I get the impression from you that when you made that first one, that's not what you did.
I can't remember how we enlarged it, but they just weren't very good painters. But anyway, it was also an image that was, because of its simplicity, had to be perfectly executed. The most scenic backdrops are just that. They're scenes. There's the lake scene, or it's a scene. So what the hell difference does it make? The trees don't look realistic. It doesn't matter. It's a theatrical convention. But this was something else entirely, where the way it was painted was kind of important. So of course it was a failure. But you learn on the job. But I think what Terry is alluding to is the way that scenic artists learn to represent reality is through a series of coded gestures. So the way you lay in shadows is like this. The way you put in highlights is like this, which is similar to conventional realistic painting, realism, and yet it's adapted for that scale and for those materials, and also to be able to do it at speed. So there's a whole bunch of tricks that scenic painters know that I learned, and that I in turn trained my scenic painters to paint more like real painters, with like a more painterly analysis of how the planes intersect and where the light source is coming from. These are kind of things that scenic painters don't really care about. They just want to get it done. So that over the course of many years, working with the same scenic artists, I kind of adapted my style to their skills and vice versa. And I think when you look at my work, especially the paintings we're looking at now, we actually see me having digested the conventions of scenic painting as much as the other way around.
Well, that's a good skew into talking a little bit about the paintings that we're sitting in front of, because I think of them as being both enormously theatrical and also cinematic. And what I mean by that is that when I think of theatrical stage sets and stuff like that, I think about dimensionality. Because there is going to be something in front of it that is interacting with it, whether it's abstract or more representational. And I think of these as being cinematic because of the flatness and the lack of that kind of perspective.
Yeah, we've talked about them before, and I mean in public situations before. There was a tall order. The idea of working from the Sistine Chapel imagery was not my idea, and I thought it was a terrible idea, but I said I was willing to try it and see what happened. But I really did think of the raw material, so to speak, as a piece of theater. I mean, they are like theatrical drops, but instead of having singers or dancers in front of them, the painting has to do all the work. So there's the insets and silk screens and blah 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 to pick up the slack, so to speak. But yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of making a painting like this, because I do think that process has a place in a kind of a conversation like this, where people will look at these paintings and say, aside from the fact that we know that it's a take on the three of the areas of the Sistine Chapel, you think, how did he come up with these particular choices of the images that he used, and why is there a lamp and a lampshade in the same picture plane with something that is clearly referential to the Michelangelo painting? And what is that red blobby thing in the middle?
We've already been asked that once tonight. Well, the raw material is what it is. I mean, they're just copied from Michelangelo and painted. The Michelangelo parts are painted in acrylic, very much the way scenic art is painted. They're kind of flat-footed, descriptive, using relatively few colors. I mean, the colors are fresco. Trying to animate the Michelangelo's drawing without competing with Michelangelo as painting. They're not painted as fresco, but they're mimicking fresco. It's a theatrical trick. If you're going to make a painted backdrop of something, you're not really painting it, you're mimicking it. There's a level of mimicry involved, and that's why I thought it would be worth trying to do this. You could mimic something like the Sistine Chapel. That's the first layer, and I do them whenever I do them and put them aside. It's almost like I put them in the closet. And then when I take them out again, whether it's a month later or 6 months later or a week later, it's as if that's a found object. That's a given. That everything else is simply a reaction to, and that you could say the background painting or the Sistine Chapel part of the painting is the text. Then I have to then be both the actor and the director and the choreographer and the composer to bring all the other elements to it to bring it on its feet, get on its feet. How the specific other images appear, I've never been able to answer except to say it's intuitive and that it makes sense to me at the time. I'm not even sure I could recreate why that's there as opposed to something else. But the images have to work as it does in everyone's painting. This is not true just for me. This is true generally. Everything has to work both as shape, volume, scale, color, reference, poetic image, and poetic / narrative image, and as a compositional anchor. So my main criteria for a painting like this, or for any painting really, is, does it keep my eye moving? Does it keep my eye engaged in a dynamic way? That's really the only criteria that I have. So everything that I'm doing is at the service of that, which means that everything is allowable or acceptable as long as it doesn't stop.
Do you have folders and binders full of images that you shop through when you're looking for
I
things
do sort of.
to?
I have boxes of stuff, most of which I ignore, but sometimes I look through them, and then sometimes things just come to me, either because of a visual memory, a sense memory of a certain space, like the space in the Velázquez painting of the open book. There, I just had that kind of like dead / deep space by the book, which seemed very appropriate for the Last Judgement panel. So sometimes there's a very specific historical / sense memory image that I'm calling up. Other times it probably would look quite random, like it could be this, could be that. But it's not random once it's in the painting. Then it has to be made, it has to pull its own weight. Everything has to pull its weight.
And you picked 3 major areas of the chapel: the creation, the flood,
creation, the flood, and Last Judgement. I mean, you could have picked 16 others, but these seem to be the most instantly recognizable, and they let's hit the high points, so to speak.
Well, and I have to say that if one were to have to say which of these is your favorite painting, for me it would be the Flood.
The Flood.
And I just find, essentially, I think what I respond to the most in this are the other cultural references that are in there. There's such an interesting mishmash. I mean, you've got your Hokusai, which almost everybody in the world will recognize. You've got references to Andy Warhol. You've got the references to Hurricane Katrina, as well as the tsunami in Asia, and all of a sudden you start to think about floods and
flooding's a big topic, a big issue right now. Yeah, it's on everyone's mind. Yeah.
and the water is a big issue, right? The other question I wanted to ask you about compositionally about these 3 pictures is that right-hand panel on each one that they obviously are thought that each one of those has that same kind of swirl. What's going on there?
Well, there's 2 things to say about composition. As we were walking through the Helen Frankenthaler show earlier, you see every painter has a certain kind of handwriting, not just the handwriting of the mark, but the handwriting of the composition, and it has to do with what I think has to do with it's a theory of what they were exposed to at a certain critical period. Just as we know, the reason Pollock's paintings hold together as well as they do is because Thomas Hart Benton made Pollock diagram Titian paintings and Veronese paintings, and the Venetian school, when he was a student, which is really the time in Italian painting when composition was laid out along ironclad rules and incredibly useful systems of dispersing imagery over a large canvas. And the fact that Pollock, when he was very young, had to do that over and over and over again, the dynamic use of the diagonal that you find in Venetian painting is so deeply embedded in Pollock's painting that he couldn't go wrong. It was like he had a net. The Venetian painting sense of compositional space was Pollock's net. So whatever Pollock did, whether it was on the floor, on the wall, or imagistically or abstract, it was going to have that scaffolding, and that's what really makes Pollock Pollock, in addition to everything else. And you can see in the Frankenthalers, she has also, you can absorbed certain pictorial structures, either having to do with the frame and the empty center or the reverse, or how things are sequenced top to bottom, left to right. And once you're making something other than a monochrome painting, sequencing with the eye's journey through the painting is of paramount importance, and in my experience anyway, the most fun that you can have as a painter. So not to compare myself to him in any way, but it just so happens that my teacher made me do all the same stuff, diagramming all these Renaissance painters and absorbing this lesson of what's called dynamic symmetry to the point where anything I draw now or paint, you can find it in that as an understructure in the composition. I don't have to think about it anymore. It's second nature. It's always been there. Apparently, I couldn't get rid of it even if I wanted to. So we can thank our teachers or curse our teachers, as the case may be. Right? But so that's the dominant part of the picture. As to your actual question, what's going on with the right panel? I wanted to give myself a harder problem, and at the time, it actually has something. I can blame this on Eric Fischel. Eric came to me at a certain point. What is this? 15 years ago, 10 years ago? I don't remember anymore. I was someone who was not interested in entering into the computer age at all, to put it mildly. I wanted nothing to do with the computer. I could see Eric was composing his pictures in Photoshop. He said, "This is great, man. This is made for you. Your kind of work. You'll love this." Eric, I don't want any part of it. Just count me out. And he made me sit down one day, and he showed me what you can do in Photoshop. He said, "No, look at this. Look at all these effects. Isn't this cool?" And I said, "No, it's not cool." And then it happened that he pressed some button that was cool, and that button allows an image to be turned into an anamorph, the kind of thing that painters used to do in the 17th century and 16th century, using a convex mirror. You can now do it on the computer in a millisecond. And I had to concede that he was right. There was something useful in a painterly universe about this, condensing an image, especially a kind of cartoony portrait image into a vortex. So then the question is, well, can the vortex work with the Michelangelo part? And the answer was, I don't know. Let's find out. And I remember when I was working on these, I had I was in a rented studio in near Sag Harbor in the industrial park, and Kynaston McShine came over. And Kynaston was a very, very astute but extremely tough critic, and someone I adored, but he had to be prepared. And Kynaston came over. I think I was working on the first one only, and he just looked at it. And he said, "Well, you really don't want to have the viewer asking the question why that panel's there." I said, "I know, Kynaston. Thanks for pointing that out. You can go now." What he meant was I hadn't solved it yet. I hadn't cracked it yet. So he never saw them finished. I don't know if he would have softened his view or not, if he would have thought that they had worked. But, the fact that they don't entirely work, in my book, makes them work. That there's a slight unresolvable friction between the vortex panel and the rest of the painting, and the fact that you are asked to see them in the same scan is either part of the problem, part of the fun, depending on your point of view.
Do you actively? You said that you wanted to create a problem for yourself that you needed to solve. I mean, is that actively part of your process in the studio? Is creating problems for yourself?
Yeah, I'm being a little bit glib. Not really. I just wanted to see it. It's something I wanted to see, and I knew it was going to be not easy to make it work.
Why did you put a self-portrait in the end of the world panel?
Well, because I actually wasn't, even that wasn't my idea. But Carlo Bilotti, the collector who commissioned the paintings, he pointed out to me, I knew it once, but I'm not a student of these things. He pointed out to me that in the olden days, the painter would include a portrait, an image of the patron, and also themselves sometimes. So I thought that was kind of funny, and you can see I'm there, but also on the trucks, narratively speaking, is on its way to hell. There's a picture of Carlo, and also Larry Gagosian's on the truck too. And we just put him in for good measure. There's no. So yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So.
Would you be willing to entertain a couple of questions
Yeah, sure, why not?
from the audience? Okay. You'll have to stand up and kind of shout it out.
Okay. The first thing I noticed about the white panels is they're all women.
Is it what?
They're all women, or they seem to be.
Yeah.
And is this part of the genesis and the evolution?
Good question. Didn't think about it. Good question. I should say yes.
They don't relate.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why, but I just thought they worked. So.
Anybody else? Well, I have one last question for you before we end. Can you tell me something about yourself that I don't know?
Well, how would I know if you know it? What do you mean, Terry?
Artistically speaking.
No, but I mean, you know.
Something that you're thinking about, something that is driving your work that we haven't touched on in this talk, or that might be coming up in new work that that you're trying to work out. That you would be willing to tell me.
Well, I'm not hiding anything. No secrets. I mean, this is probably not a revelation, but at the same time, I've spent 35 years making these complicated, very composed, multi-layered pictures. I've also been making very straightforward single image pictures, but hardly ever show them. But I'm actually having a show in September of just portraits, just heads, no fancy stuff, no juxtapositions, just painted heads. Either they stand or fall on their own merits. So that feels kind of very exposed. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was looking for. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you all for coming.